Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal, an assistant superintendent, and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. Hello, imperfect leaders. So I've started a new book. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. Written by Rutger Bregman, it's really challenged me to embrace a new way of thinking about the human race. What I mean is I'm really leaning into that growth mindset part of the nested pattern dimension of the human-centered school transformation model I talk about so often. So when I'm asked by Bregman, the author, whether I believe our society is on the brink of anarchy, I answered convincingly, a resounding yes. It's interesting, as he's writing this, he's planning for that answer. And then he tells you, or us, the readers, that we have fallen victim to something called the veneer theory, the idea that things are mostly bad and that anything good is just a thin layer of good masking all the bad. And then he goes on to describe people's behaviors, their positive behaviors, like during 9/11 and during Hurricane Katrina, that the actual good behaviors of people, not the misreported and never corrected stories of murder and pillaging and all that. He goes on, he talks about that, and he talks about the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, and really how in their work, that nearly 700 field studies that were done since 1965, that there's never been total mayhem following a disaster. In fact, people overwhelmingly rise to the occasion to help their neighbors, as well as total strangers. And that makes sense when you think about it. In my book, which is coming out in June, pre-order information coming soon on my website, peterstiepelman.com, I talk about the examples of people bringing out their best selves. The more I think about it, it's true. We remember the bad, but they are really outnumbered by people doing good. So in this week's episode, my guest also rose to the occasion and helped out a district nearly an hour away when they didn't have a superintendent. He served simultaneously as the superintendent of 2 Iowa school districts for a year. He modeled what he expects from the children in his own district: to serve locally and regionally, and to graduate with an eye on ways to serve globally as well. He talks about character as a necessary ingredient for graduates. You're really going to enjoy what Tony Aylsworth has to say, especially the important lesson about any election, that every vote counts. You're really going to want to listen to this. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Tony Aylsworth is my guest, and Tony's been the superintendent of the Pleasantville Community Schools in Pleasantville, Iowa since 2014. And before that, he was a high school principal, and all along he's been an adjunct professor as well, an instructor at Iowa State University, at Drake, at Viterbo. Tony, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Hey, Peter, good afternoon. It's great to see you again, my friend, and I'm happy to be here as a part of this project.
Tony, you and I met each other when we were both pretty new superintendents, and I've followed you over the years, and I've been really impressed on how you stand up for public schools and demand that, for example, charter schools have the same accountability systems in place as public schools. I've been inspired by the way that you look at innovations in other industries and think about how they might be applied to educational settings. Like, I'm thinking specifically about augmented and virtual reality. I think you had like a post like 5 years ago after visiting a hospital. And then last year, you were thrust into an interesting professional situation. For one thing, you were leading your school district, Pleasantville, through the pandemic. And then you found yourself as the superintendent of not one district, but 2. You served as the superintendent of Earlham for the year last year. And so, the aim of this podcast is to learn about how superintendents think, how they plan, how they lead, how they use systems, and how they learn lessons. And I wonder if you would tell us just a little bit about that experience, about how you went about leading 2 school districts with some similarities and likely some real differences. And I wonder if you just tell us about it and what'd you learn?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about it. It was a really kind of cool experience. Came about in a very unexpected way. You referenced my adjunct service. So, rewind about 5 or 6 years ago, I had Earlham's curriculum director as a student in a graduate course at Iowa State University and made some impression on her. Apparently, it was some sort of a favorable impression. Fast forward, and they had an unexpected resignation from their superintendent. And it was late June, early July, and their board was not confident that they could secure a replacement that they would be happy with. And so the state of Iowa, pretty small state, the legislature, I love how they frame this in a way that they frame it in a way that makes you think that they want to give schools more money. But really, there's this legislation that was passed called operational sharing. And the issue behind the issue is that they think it was going to force some consolidation and closure in Iowa. And so there's these financial incentives to share operations and leadership positions. And so both school districts, Pleasantville and Earlham, evaluated this possibility. And it was kind of a unique experience in that we knew it was just a one-year thing. It was just to help them kind of bridge that gap so they could get the next leader in place that they wanted and needed. And so, yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Peter. There's definitely some similarities. So we're in the same athletic conference as Earlham. In terms of a commute, it was about a 55-minute drive for me, which in Iowa is a lot. Other states, maybe that's the norm, but it was a great experience. There was a lot of two-way idea sharing in terms of systems thinking. We're similar enough that I could steal some ideas from Earlham, whether it was around teaching and learning, whether it was about a lot of the business office functions that they had were really tight, and things that I could steal and bring back to Pleasantville and replicate. And likewise, a lot of my experiences and the wisdom I'd picked up on over the last 7 or 8 years in Pleasantville really translated well to that district. So it was a wonderful experience. I think the thing that always shocks people when they ask me about it is I oftentimes hear, I bet you're glad you're not doing that anymore. And I'll be very honest with you, in year number 9 as superintendent here in Pleasantville, I would do that again in a heartbeat. I really enjoyed the experience. I miss my former colleagues over in Earlham. I was only with them for a year. But I love the experience. It was a unique leadership challenge. I viewed it as kind of a stretch assignment to push myself a little bit in terms of leadership capacity and moving 2 districts forward at the same time. And I certainly miss it and enjoyed the challenge.
So I think I'd like to explore that just a little bit more because I'm curious about what that looked like, particularly knowing it was a 1-year position. And so in the leadership model that I've been using to advise others, there's this dimension called collective aspiration. And if I were to describe it, I would just say that it's like the heart of the model. It speaks to how we want to be together and what you want to create together. And inside that dimension is this term, compelling purpose. And sometimes I describe it as like a district's mission. Mm-hmm. My mentor, Linda Henke, she wrote how ancient peoples use cairns, like piles of rocks, to mark important paths and to guide them on their journeys, and that these rock piles assured travelers that they were on the right path and that their journey would be successful. And it made me think about how a compelling purpose and the shared images of success of an organization, that collective aspiration, how they function in much the same way as a rock cairn. And they mark an agreement about the path that we're all going to take. And so I'm curious, how do you go about establishing what shared images of success look like in Pleasantville? And then I'm also interested in your stewardship in Earlham, right? You're there for 1 year. How do you work toward collective aspiration as you help them prepare for that district's next leader? So why don't we start first with just how do you do that in terms of shared images of success in Pleasantville? What does that look like?
Yes. So success at Pleasantville, where I reside, my children attend school, and I've worked for almost 10 years, looks much different to me than what it does in Earlham. In Pleasantville, our work right now aligns certainly with our mission. And you take all the mission statements in the world, you boil them down to a handful of things, but really we're just about creating conditions that set kids up for success. And so I view it as an opportunity here to define what success looks like for kids. I want kids from all walks of life walking out of this place feeling confident and equipped to take on whatever the world's got in store for them. And we're doing a great job here, and I'm very proud of this, that, if I rewind 20 years ago, I went to a school in rural Iowa, very similar to this school myself. But the attitude at that school was certainly you're either college bound or you're a borderline failure. And so we've done a great job of creating pathways for kids that align with, the conditions and the things that we think will make them happy and employable and engaged citizens. And so, I know that the work is not entirely unique. In fact, if you and I were to rewind 7 or 8 years ago, we heard about this from Dr. Dave Schuler, who's now the new executive director at AASA, but around redefining what ready looks like for kids. And so creating those pathways around the ability to communicate, to collaborate, to be resourceful, to be a person of high character and integrity. And then even we're trying to sprinkle in things like trying to create more of a mindset and heart around service. And service locally, service regionally, service on a bigger scale. But, that's the work right now, Pleasantville. When I think about our mission-driven work, that's what we're doing right now is creating the opportunities in the curriculum, in the way we deliver instruction. We're deliberately designing opportunities in those routines to make sure that kids get not only awareness of those 5 domains that we think are important and critical, but also grade level appropriate direct instruction around what that means and a lot of opportunities to engage with that content.
I've talked to a number of superintendents around the nation, and there have been different and varying ways of talking about what you've just described in terms of like the portrait of a graduate and those types of things, or what readiness looks like. I can't say that I've heard a lot about character in the same way that you did in terms of service. Would you give us an example of what that might look like, maybe at the different levels or one level in particular? What does service look like, local and regional, or you said even larger than that? How do you share that with your community?
I think it starts by creating opportunities for staff to sort of collect and sort and select those opportunities. A lot of our kids just don't know about those opportunities that exist. Here in our local community, here in Marion County, here in the Des Moines metro area where we live. And so the biggest piece to that, Peter, has just been an opportunity for a secondary teacher and an elementary teacher to sort of catalog and organize those and then carve that time out. We're so protective. I remember very clearly the first time I read the Marzano research around protecting instructional time. And we're so protective of that time that I think as a younger, less experienced administrator, I was so fearful of our math scores or our science scores taking a dip that we had to just focus on math and science all the time. And not to downgrade those areas, they're certainly important, but there's value in these other areas too. Frame them however you want, the portrait of a graduate or the 21st century skills or character ed if you've been around long enough. But for us, it's been organizing the opportunities and then carving out the time to do it. So in our school district, you'll see groups of kids organizing a day. We call them passion projects or club projects where some of the kids started a running club. Some of them started a club that studies the history of rock and roll music. Some of them play cribbage. And then there's a group that just volunteers and organizes all these opportunities. And I see it's really cool to see 2nd and 3rd and 4th graders doing this work right alongside juniors and seniors in high school. And we're a small enough community that it works. And then just advertising it, you taking advantage of the social media opportunities and making parents aware and helping kids understand why it's important have all been kind of critical pieces to how we've framed this thing up and made it an important part of what it means to be a Pleasantville Trojan.
So it's interesting because I could imagine pre-pandemic it was important, post-pandemic or wherever we are right now, that it is essential in terms of children having the opportunity to learn from each other, to see each other, to play with each other, to disagree with each other in a safe place. I imagine service also includes working in food banks or your local United Way or in nursing homes, in lots of different ways to show empathy and compassion. That is something that maybe during the pandemic we didn't show our best selves all the time. And this is about restoring who we are as a community, what we believe, and what we want for children in the future as they become adults, that this just becomes an ingrained habit to help others, to be of service to each other and one's community.
Yeah, helping them see the value of it. I think kids are in such a mindset where it's like, how does it benefit me? And they see that firsthand a lot of times at home and in other places around social media and TV and so forth. But yeah, I think helping kids understand that there's value to it and that sometimes it's an intrinsic value, and then other times, as an example, I sit on a scholarship committee, probably the largest scholarship foundation in our area here in the greater Marion County area. And that was eye-opening to me. I was the only school superintendent on the committee. Everybody else is a school counselor. But I think there's this mindset amongst parents, particularly those of really highly driven academic type kids, that it's all about ACT score and all about a couple of very, very black and white sort of quantitative measures. And the reality is that committee is a great example of one that weights service just as much, if not more, than some of those other metrics that used to be very important. And so I try to paint that picture and help them understand that the world is sort of evolving there. And there's obviously value to doing those things and feeling good about the service you're providing to the community. But also there's other things that can come of it, the ability to network and build relationships. And
so I wonder, is the work that you did in Earlham, is that one of the things that you sort of brought over in terms of some ideas? Really curious. Regionalization or consolidation is on the minds of many superintendent groups, particularly in rural America. And so you're my first person I've talked to that did it in a different way. You didn't consolidate, but they, for a year, had the same superintendent. So I'm curious if you talk a little bit about what'd you bring there? What did they bring back?
Yeah. So I probably should have provided this background, but the agreement we structured with Earlham was very clear. And I think that was an important distinction because their expectations around what I was going to do and provide in one day a week were very reasonable. So it was in Iowa terminology, it was considered an 80-20 share. So I spent 80% of my time in my home district and 20% of my time up there. I went to Earlham every Wednesday. I left very early and spent the day there. And really what I feel like in hindsight that I brought more so than anything there was just stability. And believe it or not, in one day a week to bring stability. I just think it speaks a little bit to that situation where it was a team of highly talented people, the administrative team, the office, the executive cabinet, all very talented, capable people, but they were just so stiff and they'd been together so long. The least senior member of that team, other than me, had been there 13 years. And so they were just very used to business as usual and sort of stuck in a rut. And, I appreciated some of the things you put in the message leading up to this. Like, I think I can have a fairly disarming personality. I like to keep it light. I like to joke. And I think what I helped that team do is break down some barriers where work had kind of gotten stagnant and boring and brought in some fresh ideas and perspective and helped them kind of lay the groundwork. They brought in a consultant to lead a search for a new superintendent. And really that was a very seamless transition because I think their community, their district, their board saw maybe a model that could work or a personality leadership profile that could work for that district and sort of targeted that through their hiring process. So it was neat to see. There's a lot of little things. I think just operationally, I brought several ideas to just help them think differently about things, particularly as it relates to HR practices. But I'm guessing as you're wanting to talk through kind of an inspirational, uplifting podcast, HR topics isn't what we wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, I think people do lean in on them. So I would say this, though. It seems to me, and you talk about your personality and who you are, that what you were able to do for them was almost to serve as like a town crier in the sense of like, every Wednesday you'd arrive and say, all is well, but more importantly, here are the wonderful things that I'm seeing throughout this district and to sort of lift them up. So they've got good processes in place. They're running smoothly, but you provided for them this sort of weekly injection of energy, ideas, and support that they'd likely needed. And knowing that you were there for a year and helping them sort of think differently about what their next leader might be is probably your legacy there. So I think that's exciting. So how does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
Well, as two former Spanish teachers sitting here talking about, we both know imperfect is one of the two simple past verb tenses, right? So there's that. No, but I think in the context of leadership, I view an imperfect leader as someone that knows themselves well, knows their strengths, knows their weaknesses, and is capable of surrounding themselves with other leaders who will bring divergent opinions and counsel forward in the name of service and towards the kind of the greater good. And that resonates with me several ways. I mean, I think the most compelling thing as I thought about my leadership journey, I believe as a less experienced administrator, particularly early on when I was in my 20s, I got into this much sooner than I anticipated. And I admittedly had a tendency to be drawn to leaders with a similar approach, style, and profile. And so, in almost year number 20 now, having done this a while, it's amazing, by the way, just kind of a sidebar, how quickly you go from being 20 years younger than everybody in the room. Then all of a sudden, like you blink twice and you're the guy they call with like the weird school finance questions. Like when did that transition happen? But, now that I'm a little bit more seasoned, perhaps, yeah, I know the importance of absolutely seeking out that diversity of thinking and counsel and experiences and profiles. That's really how you move an organization forward. You don't hire, a bunch of people that are wired and have the same exact belief system and same exact approach you do. And I don't think that I was a strong enough leader 20 years ago to do that. But now when I think about an imperfect leader like that, I know that now. And so I think it's somebody who can put themselves out there in a way that makes people feel inspired and uplifted.
An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest, again, is Tony Aylsworth, and he's a superintendent of the Pleasantville Community Schools in Pleasantville, Iowa. Now, in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss a little bit. So, Tony, what happened?
Yeah, so the experience I want to talk about, Peter, is a little bit of a unique one in my superintendency. This is I'm halfway through year number 9, and 3 months into my first year as superintendent, it was very evident that our facilities were in shambles. They were unhealthy, and actually they were unsafe. And so our campus included 6 portable classrooms at the elementary campus. They called them temporary buildings, but 2 of the 6 were over 35 years old. And so they're not temporary at that point. And so I knew that coming into the job, any superintendent before they apply for a job does their homework on a district to get gather all the information you can as an outsider. And I knew facilities was going to be a top priority, but this moved up my timeline considerably. The board had a major sense of urgency around this area, and sort of what we were the opposite of maybe something we were talking about offline here. They encouraged me to run a bond, a tax project much sooner than I would have anticipated. And honestly, much sooner than I would have liked. My opinion is, as a new superintendent, is that you come in, you've got that kind of that relatively unknown stage. You're still in the honeymoon phase with the community, the staff, the students. And while everybody could recognize the need, I was fearful that I hadn't had the opportunity to make any deposits with our community in terms of positive reinforcement before I had to make withdrawals. And so I knew that trust hadn't been established yet, even though I was confident we could get there. If you fast forward, the board decided that they wanted to run the bond anyway, and it did pass. It was the closest successful bond vote in the history. I would actually say in the history of the world, because it passed by 1 vote. Yeah. So
Holy cow.
Yeah. So months and months and months of work, only to have it pass by 1 vote. I was excited, of course, that it passed. And I knew that it was necessary, but the competitor in me was sad because I knew we had failed our community in terms of the law of timing and asking a new leader to a new community that he had no sort of recognition or credibility established to run a tax improvement project that would raise taxes pretty significantly for a little community like ours at a time when taxes were already kind of a pressure point in our state. So I take great pride in the fact that it passed, and I always can look back on it now. For comparison, we ran another tax project 2 years ago, which was my 7th year into the district, and it passed with almost 90% support. So, I feel good about that. But in hindsight, that definitely didn't go as planned.
So let's sort of recap. So you're a new superintendent. You recognize there are significant needs in terms of your facilities. Typically, I think it is probably about 18 months is probably the best way to sort of think about leading up to an actual election, is to start planting those seeds with your community, meeting with your chamber of commerce, meeting with city government, county government, going to every Kiwanis and Rotary Club, and really just making sure that individuals understand why. Because unfortunately, or what we recognize about humans is there's a very much a what's in it for me kind of mentality. Yes. And so if your community is older and don't have children or grandchildren in the school district, they may not see the what's in it for me. And so to have to do that in such a short runway must have been incredibly stressful. And I wonder, as you're looking back, what got overlooked?
Yeah, the biggest thing that got overlooked is, if you look at the history of this school district, there's been, counting me, there's been 4 superintendents over the past 80 or 90 years. And so the last 3 before me retired on the job. And they were all very well known, very credible, very, they're still beloved in our community. They're still all the 2 most recent retirees are still around. And so I think that they took for granted that those people had that credibility already established, that if they could go into those rooms and whatever they said was held in great esteem and great credibility. And I think now I've been here long enough to establish some of that credibility, where if people are on the edge about the vote, they're probably going to give us the benefit of the doubt because they know we're good stewards of everything they provide us. But I think they just overlook the importance of those established relationships with previous superintendents versus a rookie superintendent coming in from a large suburban district.
So what did you learn about relationships?
In this case, it reaffirmed to me that there's people here that want a great school district and want to be great. But in many instances that there's a lack of trust. And you can't take that for granted. All those different groups that we've referenced, those are groups that I regularly go to and provide updates to now when I don't need to ask them for a vote on a tax project. So I just hated that whole way it came together, where it was early in my career and the first time they're hearing from me is asking for an additional tax raise. So when I talk to newer superintendents or aspiring superintendents, that's one of those things that you get out in front of and you start making those rounds and putting yourself out there in terms of visibility and engagement way in advance of you needing something from them.
So what frustrated you?
Yeah, what I recall of that situation that really frustrated me was, it's interesting in an age of all the different social media platforms that there's not sort of the old tried and true, like organized opposition and the picketing and the signs, but rather just combating the amount of misinformation out there. It was a real challenge and one that I overlooked and really frustrated me. And it just, as a coaching point now for those that are going through it, that the important thing is to get that information out there crystal clear and meeting people where they're at. The old school bond mailers that get sent to all the addresses in the community, but you've got to have the social media pieces. You've got to have the YouTube videos and the TikTok information and just meeting people where they consume information and getting past that sector of your community that in the absence of the truth, just find their own truth. That was an unexpected challenge and frustration, but one that I now know how to deal with. I'm more equipped to deal with that as a more experienced leader.
One of the things that I was introduced to was a different way of engaging individuals, particularly. So you pass the bond, you have a list of projects that you said you were going to do, and they voted for it. And then as you are making progress towards each of those, you have ribbon cuttings. As silly as that might sound, you're just starting to move dirt, you have a ribbon cutting. And you invite lots of people who may have been part of your organized opposition. You invite lots of people who were always your supporters. And it's a way to all be together and for you to say these very simple words. We make promises and we keep them. We want to be good stewards of your money. And then you cut the ribbon, it gets in the paper, it gets celebrated on social media. And then when it's done, you have another ribbon cutting to say, we make promises and we keep them. And then here is this amazing school. And you get to also say it was finished on time and on budget, or hopefully you say under budget, but really great opportunities for you to try to recapture the narrative of we make promises and we keep them. So what could you have done differently yourself?
I probably would have been a little firmer with the board at that point in time. I knew it was a mistake to try to run that bond, even though the facility was not world class. It's not what we aspired to be and who we were. I think I would have been able to provide a little bit more wisdom in talking to the board now with my experiences that I've gone through over the past 10 years, as opposed to a rookie superintendent into year one of a superintendency where, I spoke up and expressed some concern kind of in private one-on-one conversations. But, at the end of the day, we work for the will of the board. But I think I would be able to project with a little bit more wisdom and confidence that running that campaign at that point in time was a mistake, and that another 8 to 10 months of planning and engagement in the community wouldn't hurt anything.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of it? Obviously, it passed.
Yeah, I think, even though my predecessors here are great superintendents and leaders that I enjoy great connections with, the last big project before that one would have been 20 years ago, so well before my time here. I think people look back on that as a semi-failed project. It was multiple delays and over budget and a lot of issues after the fact. And so I think one thing I'm really proud about with this project is we did commit to the scope of the project. We got it done and we did it the way we said we were going to do it. And it's just been a great project. We're 7 years past that now, and it's still the gem of the district in terms of it's the facility that every prospective parent that interviews with our principals, they can't get them over there fast enough because it's a beautiful facility. It's wonderful space for 21st century education. Our district has gone from one that has to really market and sell ourselves to prospective families to now we have become that district where families seek us out. Had that bond failed, I think that would have been had the potential to derail really good progress. So knowing that now, it makes me cringe a little bit to think about how close we were to being unsuccessful. But it catapulted our district forward. I'm convinced 5 years. This has propelled us into a district that's kind of on the outer rims of the suburbs, as opposed to a district that's out in the middle of nowhere.
My guest again today was Tony Aylsworth. Tony, when we met all those years ago at AASA in our National Superintendent Certification Program, you approached issues and conversations really in an unassuming way. So you said you like to take things light, but there's a real intellect there. And I really appreciate how thoughtful you were. And I know this is embarrassing the heck out of you, and that's good. But I mean it. Thank you for supporting me from afar. Thank you for always stepping up for kids. And thank you for always being there for teachers and other leaders and public education in general. So I really am grateful for your time.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I was flattered. I think very highly of you. And this is a cool project and one that I was glad to become more familiar with.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.